Hi, everybody. Here is our lecture on 22.2, Part D, Characteristics of Today's Parties. We're going to be talking in this lecture about how the political parties have changed over time, what they're like today. You guys will each be watching both of these videos as well as Ed Puzzles because they do a really nice job visually explaining the information. This video here explains what the party systems are. We've been talking about party systems as like these eras of time where like two parties are dominating. This gives you a really nice explanation of that as well. So let's look at how we got to our current two-party system. This emerged in 1854 when the Republicans replaced the Whigs as a major party. Since 1854, our two-party system has been dominated by Democrats and Republicans. Republicans, as a group, were formed by members who opposed slavery. Neither the Whigs nor the Democrats at that time had a super firm idea on what they wanted to do with slavery, and the Republicans wanted to oppose it. Now, it's important to note, they did not, in a national way, suggest that we abolish slavery when they first came on the scene. They wanted to limit it. They wanted new states to not have new slavery. So they wanted to limit the spread of slavery. Republicans also supported business interests at the time. Mostly the party was people in the North, and Lincoln became our first Republican president in 1860. So this is our third party system, which I want to talk about. So the third party system from 1854 to 1896. This third party system emerged over divisions over slavery. These two major parties continued to dominate American politics. These are the same parties that still exist today, but their issues, beliefs, and supporters have changed many times. And that's where we're looking at the different party systems. After the Civil War, the major parties were tightly organized. In cities, party bosses organized voters, especially immigrants. Voters were extremely loyal to their parties, and voter turnout was high. Both parties were made up of coalitions of people with diverse interests. At the national level, both parties were largely controlled by business interests in the 1880s and 1890s. During economic downturns, farmers in the South and the West organized in opposition to both parties. These populists failed to build a solid party organization, but they succeeded in putting farmers' issues on the Democratic agenda. So for this period of about 40 years, we have our Democrats and Republicans. These Republicans formed from our former Whigs, Free Soilers. These are people who did not want slavery in new states. And a few Northern Democrats who opposed the expansion of slavery. That's who the Republicans were. Whereas the Democrats were strictly the only party in the South. Remember, our African Americans were viciously prevented from voting for Republican candidates. So the Democrats pretty much owned the South. In 1896, things start to change. That's where we get our next party system, the fourth party system, from 1896 to 1932. Republicans' victory in the election of 1896 began an era of Republican dominance that lasted for 36 years. The only Democratic president during this period, Woodrow Wilson, was elected when the Republican Party split in 1912. That is a throwback to our Bull Moose Party, the third party with Teddy Roosevelt. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt wanted to be the Republican nominee. He didn't get the nomination. A lot of Republicans were completely upset about this. He basically was like, I don't need you stinking Republicans. I'm going to make my own party, and I'm going to call it after a really cool animal, the Bull Moose Party. So then you have these Republicans who are like, well, do I vote for the Republican or do I vote for Teddy Roosevelt? Because he was president and I liked him, and he is a Republican. He's just now running as a Bull Moose. Because that party split, that opened the door for Woodrow Wilson to win. But outside of Woodrow Wilson, who was our president, you should recall, during when women got the right to vote, besides that, the Republicans dominated the presidential elections. Voting blocks, meaning who supported who, were pretty much the same as in the third party system, with Republicans stronger than ever in the industrial North and winning support from people of all economic classes. Business interests dominated for most of the period, but the progressive movement rose in response, demanding reforms of industry and society. Reform had some support from both parties. The questions of how to promote business while reining in its abuses dominated our domestic politics. And the US also became increasingly involved in international affairs in the Caribbean, the Pacific, and in Europe during World War I. In the election of 1896, the Republicans spent an unprecedented amounts of money and used new advertising techniques to reach voters. Their techniques of fundraising and advertising are now the norm for both parties. So looking at each, again, the Democratic, they're heavily influenced by the South, effectively the only party in the solid South. With the Republicans, they are a bit more in favor of some of the progressive policies, more likely to support those reforms, etc. And they are strongly supported by women after the passage of the 19th Amendment. By this time now, all adults over the age of 21 are now eligible to vote, but Native Americans and African Americans were typically prevented from doing so, as we've already learned. So as we've seen, the Republicans dominate and are the majority party through 1932, again, from the Reconstruction, Gilded Age, World War I, Depression. This all starts to change, though, in 1932. We have Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. He is elected, he's a Democrat, he's elected that year. Basically, the Republicans, if I go back, especially through this period, the Republicans were so aligned with big business that when the big businesses and the stock market crashed, a lot of people blamed the Republican Party for this. They said it was your policies that allowed these businesses to act so irresponsibly, and that helped get the Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt elected. The main thing is his New Deal programs. The New Deal basically was this way, it was his plan, the Democrat Party plan to get America out of the Depression and to bring the country back to prosperity. It's through the New Deal that we established the Social Security. So Social Security is, each time you get paid, a little money gets taken out, and then later you get to claim that back after you retire. It's a very simple explanation. As well as like Medicare, right? Government-run health insurance. A lot of things that came out of the New Deal we still have today. And FDR was so successful as a president that it's really his presidency that starts to change the shift of Republicans and Democrats and what they believe in. Just a little side note here. This image here is only one of the very few images of FDR in his wheelchair. He was physically disabled because he had contracted polio as a child and he really couldn't walk. As president, he took great care to make sure that no one spread around images of him in his wheelchair. He wanted to project an image of strength, and he didn't want people to see him as physically handicapped. Now, what's really interesting is that when you go to Washington, D.C., which I hope that you all are lucky enough to have the opportunity to do, some of you have gone already, make sure you check out his memorial. That's actually my favorite place in the National Mall. And what's cool is when you go there, there's a life-size statue of FDR in a wheelchair. Now, that did not always exist. You might remember that in the 60s and 70s, this is when a lot of these marginalized groups start advocating for their rights. So we've learned about the civil rights movement for African Americans. We've learned about the women's movement. A lot of you guys engaged in the extra credit from last quarter on the LGBTQ rights movement. There's also a movement for disabled Americans as well to get laws to support their community. And in the 70s, for a long time, there had been a statue of Roosevelt standing up straight without his wheelchair. The Americans with Disabilities Coalition, they lobbied Congress to change it and replace the statue to actually show history as it was, right? Why shouldn't we celebrate the fact that we had a president who was physically disabled? So that was changed. And if you go there now, you see the new statue. But after Roosevelt's terms, power shifted back and forth between the Democrats pretty much for the remainder of the century. So let's take a look. This is where we now get into our fifth party system from 1932 to 1968. The Great Depression had discredited the Republican Party's support of business interests. In 1932, Democrat FDR was elected president by working class whites, African Americans, and Southern whites. This New Deal coalition or groups of people coming together to support a common cause, would keep the Democrats in power nationally for decades. Between 1932 and 1968, Republicans controlled the White House for only 8 years and the Senate for 2. They would not hold a majority in the U.S. House of Reps until 1994. So Democrats really run the fifth party system. After World War II, both parties supported strong national defense. The Republican Party was divided between moderate and conservative wings and did little to challenge the New Deal social programs. But the New Deal coalition broke down in the 60s amid social turmoil, the civil rights movement, and the Vietnam War. Southern and working class whites began voting for Republican candidates in national elections, and the Republican Party gradually grew more conservative. That's where we're going to start to see, it's really in this fifth party system that we start to see things starting to realign, right? Where the Republicans are going to become increasingly more Southern and increasingly more conservative, right? Against the big government programs like the Democratic New Deal. We're also going to see the Democrat Party become increasingly more located in the North and in favor of things like civil rights and bigger use of government power. What about the six-party system? Historians disagree about when or whether the fifth political party system ended. I would say it did. Some argue that it broke down in 1968 when Republican Richard Nixon won the White House. Others point to Reagan's election in 1980. Why these two people? Well, really, Nixon and Reagan took that Republican Party in the direction of conservatism. Okay, they are really going to solidify that Republican view that we should limit government. Remember, that's the main belief of the Republican Party today, and that didn't always exist before. Because if you think about it, going back during Reconstruction and the Civil War, like this third party system, and even leading into the fourth party system, Republicans really expanded federal power. They used the federal government to push forward the Reconstruction Amendments and to do a lot of other things. But really, when we get to this election in 68 with Richard Nixon, that's when the Republican Party has fully embraced this view of small, limited government. And that's the big shift. That's why we see the shift. Republicans now dominate national elections in the South and in the West, while Democrats now typically win in the Northeast and other urban areas. The two parties are more clearly divided ideologically than they've ever been before. I guess since the Civil War, Republicans support strong national defense, low taxes, and small government, and prefer state power over federal power. Democrats, on the other hand, support a strong and active national government and are more likely to support social programs and progressive income taxes to pay for them. As the ideological divisions between the parties have grown clearer, more and more money has been spent on elections, and political arguments have grown increasingly less civil. I think you guys are pretty aware of that point. Yet more people than ever actually identify as independents, right? I'm not either party. I'm independent. I want to make my own decision. So let's look more about the general beliefs of Democrats and Republicans today. Generally, this is the most basic sense, Democratic Party believes that the federal government should take responsibility for many social problems, such as aid to the poor. So it's this idea that we should be using the government to make change. That is similar, okay, to this idea going back to our political ideologies of this liberal ideology, right? We should be using government to make change in society. Democrats are more likely than Republicans to support tax increases to pay for these programs, right? If we're going to use government to fix society, we got to pay for it, so cough up that tax money. And Democratic Party is also more likely to support labor unions. In a very basic sense, the Republican Party, on the other hand, being more conservative, generally supports reducing the power of the federal government. Republicans tend to believe that state and local governments, as well as non-governmental organizations or NGOs, should take more responsibility for the social programs. This isn't the job for the government, this is the job for the people. That's kind of the idea. So let's look at some more specific ideas. We'll go through the Democrats first. So you'll notice here I have Democrat, moderate, liberal, radical, progressive. You could also even add like Democratic Socialists up there as well. Within each party, there's a spectrum, and that's important to know. Not all Democrats are the same. Not all Republicans are the same. People have moderate beliefs. There's a lot of like room to play in that spectrum. But in a very general way, Democrats favor government regulation of the economy, right? We want government to put rules on what businesses can and can't do. We want to have the government involved in the running of the economy. They favor higher taxes for high income earners and a redistribution of that revenue to programs for the poor. So Democrats would say, from that liberal perspective, we need to use these programs to help people achieve a better life. And the way that we should do that is by taxing the rich. If you've made all this money off the backs of these poor workers, right? Think about like Jeff Bezos, right? Who's actually making that money? Sure. Did Jeff Bezos come up with the idea for Amazon? Yes. Genius. I love Amazon. But also, Democrats tend more to support those organized labor unions, support the actual workers, like the people who are actually packing the shipping boxes, like they should be supported more by the government. They favor keeping welfare in place for the poor and disadvantaged. And when it comes to schools, they favor keeping the money within the public school system. So again, Democrats, all of these views are more liberal. Let's use the government to help society, to help change society, to move it forward. Republicans, on the other hand, right? We have our moderate Republicans, conservative, our right wings, right? There's a spectrum. They are the opposite. In a very general sense, they want less government intervention in the economy. They don't like the idea of organized labor telling bosses and businesses what to do. They favor lower taxes and breaks for high income earners because they believe that'll encourage business investment and economic growth. This, in a nutshell, is what we would call trickle-down economics. It's something's trickling down. Whereas Democrats would say, we need to make high-income earners chip in more for society, and once we get the money as the government, then the government will decide how to use that money to help society. Republicans have a very different philosophy. Republicans believe, no, the government should be taking way less money from Americans. You guys keep your money, because what we believe is that if we have lower taxes and if people keep more of their money, especially the rich, they will make good decisions, probably better decisions than the government. They will make good decisions about how to reinvest that money in the economy, right? If we let people keep more of their money, that means that they'll have more money to spend, which means they'll spend more, which means there'll be more demand for these products, and all these businesses will grow. The economy will grow as well. So two really different economic policies. When it comes to what to do with that money, again, really in line with this small government view, Republicans favor cutting back welfare benefits because they believe that, in a way, providing welfare to people who need it actually encourages them to become dependent on welfare, right? We think that cutting welfare or making it harder to receive welfare will actually make it more attractive to people to actually get a job, or to work more hours as well. Whereas Democrats would say we need to keep welfare in place because that's our responsibility as the government. We have to take care of these people. So they disagree on the effects of welfare. Something that's important to note that I think is a really critical statistic to know when it comes to kind of debating the role of welfare in our society is that the majority of people on welfare do work full time. In our society, actually, let me see if I can pull it up for you. Let's see, what do I want to search? It's this idea that, like, even in America, 40-hour, you can still work a 40-hour work week on minimum wage and not be above the poverty level. So let me look at this. The poverty levels, I'm going to say, I'm going to search the term minimum wage. So this is another thing that people are wondering, should we raise the minimum wage? Because in today's society, even if you do have living wage, even if you do have a full-time job, in most states, even if you have a full-time job and you work 40 hours a week, at minimum wage, you actually still can't afford, what is this? You can't afford an apartment, or you may still need to get benefits. There was an interesting map I had seen before. The living wage, let's see. So a living wage is how much you actually need to live in terms of above the poverty line. So in 2020, the Department of Health and Human Services set the federal poverty level at $26,000 for a family of 4. So that's the equivalent to about $12.60 per hour for a full-time worker. That's the wage that you need to get to be over the federal poverty level. But workers in many states only make a minimum of $7.25 an hour. So it kind of goes by cities. I can put this on the classroom if you're interested. I just want to see what Rhode Island is. And then we'll see what the living wage. What are we, Providence County? It's like Providence County. Okay. So in Providence County, if you're one adult, you need to be making at least $12.76 to be afford to live above the poverty level in Providence, but the minimum wage is $10. So definitely people are looking at realigning that. I'm sorry, I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but I hope that it was like helpful to explaining like how people see these different things. That's basically the end of this lecture series. You guys are now going to look more deeply at how the party has changed over time.